Ray, thank you for joining me today again for part 2 of Moses for a penny for your thoughts. Now, we talked about Moses, how and his leadership, that he wasn't perfect, but he was had great qualities of humbleness, and he loved the Lord with all his heart. And I want to talk about the qualities that we have, in the sense of, like, God does want us willing, but sometimes we can feel perhaps inadequate. So what would you say to somebody who would feel inadequate? Because Moses did for a bit, because like he had this stammer. So how would you address that? A penny for your thoughts.
I often say to people, what is it that God has done with you up until now?
Okay.
The Bible talks about bringing to remembrance things, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Not that I'm sitting there sort of thing, aren't I wonderful? And I'm the greatest thing since sliced bread, because I'm not. There are things I know and I know how to do, but I have to resist the temptation to presume that everything is the same. So I often say to people, what is it that God has used you so far? And I get them to recount what it is that the Lord has actually used through them and done through them, and suddenly they start to realize actually God will use them. And certainly you're encouraged in this whole arena of what is your personal devotions like with him? Have you spent time with God today? Have you spoken with him? Have you allowed him to speak to you? Because he starts to show you things. I do believe there's a gap often between the call of God and the commission of God, you see. And I'm sure you can testify, God called you many years ago on many things. He spoke to you years ago about those things.
Yes.
But there is a gap between when God calls you and when God commissions you quite often. Moses is an example of this.
Yes.
The call of God was on his life from the moment he went into the River Nile before the princess found him. And you see going through his life in that first 40 years that God had called him about releasing the nation of Israel. That and the whole building up to that statement of let my people go there. And there was the call of God. So he had 40 years of which the call of God was upon him. Then there was another 40 years while the call of God is still upon him, but it hasn't happened at that moment. That's and right. Then after 80 years, suddenly there's the commission.
Exactly.
Because there are things which had to happen in Moses, which if he'd gone before Pharaoh, before the first 40 years was over, I dread to think what would have happened. Hang on a minute, I'm the prince, and what have you. It worries me often where you get some younger ministers who get it in their head that they, somehow or the other, they're going to lead some sort of coup in a church and the rest of it. And there is a principle that says as something is born, so it will reproduce. The Bible talks about there are things which go from the second, third, fourth and fifth generations within families. And that can be true also, that everyone I know who has established a work which came out of rebellion, all right, invariably it collapses at some point, because all it does, it just keeps reproducing rebellion. So if Moses had gone before Pharaoh in that first 40 years, it probably would have come out of rebellion, and what would it reproduce within Israel? And then you have the 40 years of God working through and encouraging people to say, well, what is it that God has done with you? What is it that God has said to you in this way? And actually, this is where it comes important, like writing things down, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
There are important moments that you write down. Because I've often said to people, people can't tell, well, God has said this to me. I said, well, what did God actually say? And you keep on, and eventually, and sometimes what happens is we embellish.
Yes.
And if we're not careful.
Yeah.
I remember talking to Reinhard Bonker. It's very easy to sit here and name drop, isn't it? You know, I was talking to someone the other day, and how we can embellish things that's there. And they were talking about some of them. And I said, oh, by the way, I met David Bowie, you know, the rock artist. And they went, wow. You see, what actually happened was I was in the St. John Ambulance Brigade. We were doing a first aid gig in Romford. And just before, you know, he was appearing with the Spiders. And we got this call, oh, one of the band has injured his hand. Can you go and have a look? So we went in the changing room. David Bowie was in the corner looking like he was smashed out of his head, you know. And so I'm just looking at this band member's finger. Now I could say to you, I've met David Bowie, you know, but actually he was in the corner, not really reacting with anyone. But it sounds good, doesn't it? You know, you know, it's like someone once said, you know, yeah. I said to someone once, I said, do you know what the Queen said when my name was mentioned to her? And they said, no. I said, she said, who? You know? And we can, but I mean, I remember sitting down talking with Reinhard Bonker once. Probably one of the most humble men I've ever come across. He was not puffed up at all in in what he was saying and what he was doing. And when you heard about his story and how that God had led him to where he was and the background he'd come from, you turn around and you see how that God had kept him there. But the one thing which kept him going was what God had said to him. So I often say to people, what has God actually said to you? You know?
Yeah.
And when they start to recount that, what he's actually said, and you often find there's not many things which he says to you. You know, they just keep you going. I remember sitting in a leaders meeting once, and there was this huge clamor, someone who had a prophetic ministry, and people going up to say, you know, have you got a word from God for us? You see, and obviously it troubled him a little bit. And anyway, after a while, he said, I need to tell you, I believe I've got a word from God for you. And everybody was there. Out come the notepads, you know, and out went the microphones and all this sort of thing. This is the most profound thing we've ever heard. He said, I believe the Lord is saying to you, you will not get another word from me until you finish the last thing I told you to do.
Wow, that's amazing, isn't it?
You know?
Yeah.
And what is it that God has said to you? And whoever's listening today, you know, what has God said to you? Keep doing the same thing until he tells you to do something else.
Yeah. Ray, I would like to ask you now, do you think people, we're talking about Moses being a leader here, do you think people should enter the ministry if they think, oh, it's a good idea, or they have that desire? I mean, do you think we need to be called and have that inner conviction where the Holy Spirit speaks to us? Because when you're called to the ministry, you're there to serve, aren't you? So what's your thoughts on that, please?
Jean, we went to college together. Do you remember that?
I do.
You remember that a few weeks ago?
Yeah.
I remember showing up at K-Paul.
Yeah, we did.
And it was interesting because when you talk to the people who were there and you'd say, why have you come to Bible college? And you talk to people and you'd say to them, why have you come? And they tended to fall into two groups. There were those who said, I believe God has told me just to come to Bible college. No problem with that, you know. And others would say, God has called me to the ministry and this is the way in, which God has opened up for me. And I can remember talking to a couple of people towards the end of my time there and saying, well, what are you going to do? And those who said, look, God had called them to the ministry, they had this complete conviction that what God had said to them. They said, I'm going into the ministry. And you say to the others who had said, I believe God has called me to the Bible college, say, what are you going to do? They said, oh, I'm going to try and go into the ministry. And invariably, all of them that said, God's called me to the Bible college, but there wasn't a clear call to the ministry. Within a couple of years, they were gone, you know, and it completely wrecked them. But those who had the sense of the call of God, obviously there were some who fell away. You talk to them, and often it is the call of God that will keep you in a very difficult situation. You've just got this sense which God has said something to you, and you are saying, well, under God, I'm going to stay. It's not an arrogant statement. It's not, oh, aren't I wonderful? It's just this conviction that is burning within you that this is what God has called me to do. And it does worry me. You often hear people now talk about, that they see the ministry as a career and it's not a vocation under the call of God.
Yes, it has to be a calling, doesn't it?
There has to be that sense in which this is what I want you to do. And yes, there are things which you let go of. I mean, Moses, you were saying earlier, weren't we? When he spoke with people, all right, chances are he did have a speech impediment.
Yes.
And so, well, they're much better speakers than me, that are out there. We look at, you see the likes of Paul, didn't you? And we talk about Paul's impediment. I will leave you to decide whichever one it was. I've heard all sorts of theories as to what it was that was wrong with Paul. But what was there was the very thing that kept him humble before God.
Yeah.
Phenomenal brain on Paul, phenomenal brain, sat under probably one of the best teachers of his day there. And yet God was saying, Paul, I need to keep you in that place of humility.
Yes. And that's a good place to be. And Ray, to finish with, do you think a pastor is a one-man band, or do you think they should delegate like Moses did?
Yeah, in the end, it comes down to the size church that you're leading. All right. I don't think the church has done itself any favors by calling the lead minister pastor, because pastor is a ministry. It's not it's a function. It is not a position. And so you can have people who have got other giftings which could equally lead the church. Yeah. But certainly when if you've got 6 people, you are seeking to raise people up all the time. But in the end, you've got 6 people, and the Bible talks about David had his leaders of the 10s, the 100s and the 1000s. And as you grow, you have to, so your skill base and your delegation skills grow with the base that you're working with. The call of God is still there, but you have to have the skills associated with leading those particular types of people. I've been on some institutions, and I remember I was a chair of a housing association. And I remember the very first board meeting I went to, we were discussing the budget. And we were talking about hundreds of thousands of pounds. And I remember sitting there thinking, oh, we're talking hundreds of thousands of pounds, you see. And then after a while, you suddenly realize actually the immensity of this is where people have been given their various jobs and what have you. £100,000 wasn't a huge amount of money for a housing association, you see. If I went home and the wife had said, I spent £2 today, I'd go, how much? Sort of thing, And you talk to people in these institutions, you talk to people who are making decisions surrounding billions of pounds of money. It's just zeros on the end of the thing. But when you learn that you need the skills, now it doesn't mean to say necessarily I've got the skill set, but I need to raise up people who have the skill sets to deal with those things. Do you remember John Barr?
I do, very much
Johnny
so.
Barr. You didn't want to be around John if he ever said to you, I believe I've got a word from God for you.
Which he did for me. But that's another story.
Yeah. I've seen John go up to people and say things what they've been doing for the last 6 months. I saw him once say, which with most people say it was an awful thing to say to someone, but they took it because they knew he loved them.
Yes.
I remember John, he was a chaplain. Effectively, he was a chaplain of a lot of the top bankers in the city of London. He used to go up there and on a regular basis, and he would sit down with chairmen of boards. We're talking people who probably could have crashed the economy, if they decided to get it wrong, and all this sort of thing up there. And John was not a well-educated man. All right. Now he read, he developed his skill set there, but he certainly didn't go to university. All right. No. He would say, I went to the University of Life. That's what he would say.
Yeah. Yes.
And one day he said to these guys, why do you have me up here? You are people of immense power. And they said to him, it's because you hear from God.
Yeah.
So have you heard from God? What has he said? And have you heard from God? If you haven't, all right, you might have to wander around the wilderness for 40 years to find out what he's actually saying. But like I said, the call of God often is there already.
Yes.
Within people. And so often you find that with some people, so is the skill set. It's already there. I can remember years ago, I play a guitar. I'm not the best. I play a guitar. All right, there. But I can remember I was at school and I used to play a B-flat trumpet, at school. And suddenly realized I'm about to leave school and the trumpet belongs to the school. So I can't afford a trumpet. And I can remember the first guitar I bought was an Eggman 12-string guitar, which didn't cost a huge amount of money. Why did I switch to the guitar? Well, I have to say now that years on, it was under God's providence. There are skill sets which you have. And that is true for you, Jean, as well. And for others that listen here, there are things which God had a hunger in your heart and you desired to do. And you might only start to see them being fulfilled now.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth in that, for sure.
Because there's nothing wrong with a seed. It's the ground you've got to get right.
Yeah, that's so true.
And that was true for Moses.
It was. It was.
How many years did God end up ploughing up his field till he finally got him to where he wanted? It was 80 years, actually.
Yeah. Well, Ray, I have to say, they have been some great thoughts today. And thank you for joining me for Penny for Your Thoughts. Ray, it's been very informative. Thank you.
Shemai.